The UK economy is resilient despite forecasts that government finances will be £122 billion worse off than previously expected by 2020, the Chancellor said. In his autumn statement, Philip Hammond said growth predictions had been cut as a result of the Brexit vote. As widely expected, he unveiled a fuel duty freeze and more cash for housing, transport and digital infrastructure. Labour said the government was unprepared and ill-equipped for Brexit and had no vision. Mr Hammond told MPs the UK's deficit would no longer be cleared by 2020, with the target instead as early as possible afterwards. Mr Hammond said the statement, his first major Commons event as Chancellor, came exactly 5 months after a Brexit vote which will change the course of Britain's history, making it more urgent than ever to tackle long-term economic weaknesses. Presenting the Office for Budget Responsibilities forecasts, he said borrowing would hit £68.2 billion this year and £59 billion next year, compared with the March forecast of £55.5 billion and £38.8 billion. The OBR said the referendum result meant potential growth in the current Parliament would be 2.4 percentage points lower than forecast in March. Government finances are forecast to be £122 billion worse off than in the spring. Mr Hammond said the government would prioritise additional high-value investment on infrastructure, which would be funded by additional borrowing. He paid tribute to his predecessor George Osborne but said he would now follow 3 new fiscal rules, to balance the books as early as possible in the next Parliament, for public sector net debt to be falling as a share of GDP by the end of Parliament and for welfare spending to be within a cap. The OBR based its forecasts on the assumption that the UK would leave the EU in April 2019. 2 years after the government's deadline for triggering negotiations with Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. It also assumed new trading arrangements would slow import and export growth for a decade and that migration would be restricted. It said the increased borrowing would result from weak tax receipts and lower than expected growth predictions as a result of June's vote to leave the European Union. Far too high. Based on its assumptions around Brexit, the government has not yet revealed the details of its negotiating plan. It predicted the referendum result would account for an extra £58 billion of borrowing. This included a predicted £16 billion increase as a result of lower migration and £18.1 billion because of lower productivity growth. The OBR said its forecasts for Brexit were uncertain, and they were disputed by Conservative MP John Redwood, who said, their forecast probably is too low. Their borrowing forecast is far too high, and we'll get good access to the single market once we're out of the EU. The Economists for Brexit group said the OBR had assumed a pessimistic outlook for the UK economy outside the EU, based on bad economic policy making. At the end of his speech, Mr Hammond revealed the autumn statement would be scrapped in future years, saying there was no need for major tax changes to be made twice a year. Instead, he added to laughter from MPs, there would be a spring statement where the government would respond to OBR forecasts, and the budget would take place in the autumn. It is not clear whether that means there will be 2 budgets in 2017. The government had already announced an extra £2 billion a year for science by 2020, a crackdown on compensation claims for whiplash injuries aimed at reducing motorists' insurance premiums and £1.3 billion to improve roads. Changes to universal credit, the flagship single payment being rolled out across the UK, will reduce the taper rate from 65% to 63%. This means benefits will be withdrawn at a rate of 63p for every pound of net earnings. The government said about 3 million households would benefit, but the Resolution Foundation think tank said their gains would be small fry compared with previously announced cuts to the work allowance, which is the amount people can earn before they start to lose their benefits. On housing, the government said it would relax rules on how affordable housing funding could be used. It said banning letting agents' upfront fees would help 4.3 million private rental tenants. Citizens' Advice welcomed measures on the agents' fees and on workers' wages but said more should be done to help just managing families. Labour, which has been calling for agents' fees to be banned, said, Any change of heart is welcome, but added that the government had no plan to fix the housing crisis. Responding to Mr. Hammond in the Commons, Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell said the Autumn Statement placed on record the abject failure of the last 6 years. He condemned the government's approach to austerity and said the people the Prime Minister promised to protect, those who are just about managing, had been betrayed. After all the sacrifices people have made over the past 6 years, I fear today's statement has laid the foundations for more wasted years, he added. The SNP said Mr. Hammond had offered little on the elephant in the room, Brexit, while the Lib Dems said the government would hit people in the pocket through their hapless handling of Brexit. But UKIP said billions were being wasted by the government delaying the UK's exit from the EU. Plaid Cymru said there was little in the statement to help rebuild the Welsh economy and close the wage gap with England.